Historical Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction novels. I'm your host, Jane Healy, and in today's episode, we welcome acclaimed author Crystal King to discuss her latest novel, In the Garden of Monsters. It's a Goodreads most anticipated historical fiction novel for fall, and it's been called a sinister romance and hypnotic gothic fairy tale. Welcome, Crystal. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
I have so many questions. So I'm going to do a quick bio about you and then we'll jump in. So Crystal King is an author, culinary enthusiast, and marketing expert. Her writing is fueled by a love of history and a passion for the food, language, and culture of Italy. She has taught classes in writing, creativity, and social media at Harvard Extension School, Boston University, Mass College of Art, UMass Boston, and Grub Street. A Pushcart nominated poet, so impressive, and former co-editor of the online literary arts journal Plum Ruby Review, Crystal received her MA in Critical and Creative Thinking from UMass Boston. Her previous novels are A Feast of Sorrow and The Chef's Secret. Welcome again. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
So I wanted to, I love this book. It's it's such an interesting premise. And I obsess over author notes. So I loved the origin story for this novel, which there's a mutual friend mentioned in the origin story. Talk about this premise and how you ended up writing In the Garden of Monsters.
So, for those of you who are not familiar with the publishing world, it's a weird one. And sometimes you can sell books, and sometimes it's harder to sell those books, even if you've got books that are out. And so I had a historical fiction novel that I was trying to sell in 2020 or 20, yeah, around that time, 2021, really, during the pandemic. And the publishing industry was in a strange place. And my the Renaissance book about essentially a meat carver to one of the cardinals in the Renaissance, it just wasn't selling. And I was really bummed about this. And I had another book that was set in the Baroque era that was about an obscure steward. And I thought, well, if they're not going to read the Renaissance book, they're not going to read the Baroque book. So I was talking to our mutual friend, Chris Walder, and she has this, she's an author, actually. She's the creator of the Goddess Tarot, which is one of the best-selling tarot decks in the world. But she's also a novelist and has a book called The Secret History. Oh gosh, I'm miss The Lost History of Dreams. That's it.
Okay.
And also, she has this wonderful book about the women of Frankenstein, Unnatural Creatures. And
Unnatural Creatures. Yes.
yeah, and that book had just come out, and I was like, I want to write something that's going to sell. What can I write that will sell? And she said, well, Gothics are hot, of course, because she just wrote this Gothic masterpiece. So I thought, well, if I thought to myself, if I were going to write a Gothic, what would I write? And the second I thought that garden that I had been to 2 years before the pandemic hit, came to my mind. This incredible place, an hour outside of Rome, in a town called Bomarzo, Italy, and it is a Renaissance garden that was created in the late 1500s, and it was overgrown for almost 400 years. And in the 20s, 30s, 40s, all these surrealist artists started going there because it was weird. This garden is full of stone monsters, and there's like all these crazy statues. The centerpiece statue is this guy, this ogre or orco. And it's on the cover of the book. Yep. And there's actually a table inside his mouth. You can walk into the mouth of this statue, this creature. He's called the Orco, which is Italian for ogre, but it's considered to be the mouth of hell. And then I started thinking, wow, that's kind of interesting. Plus, there's this old rambling castle, basically on the hill in this medieval town. The town just kind of tumbles down the hillside beyond the castle, or palazzo, I should say. And I thought this is just got all the makings of everything Gothic. But then I started thinking about what's in the garden and getting out my maps. And there's a statue of Demeter that looks right toward the mouth of hell. And there is a bench of Persephone. And then there's a Proserpina, which is the Italian name, and Ceres, which is the Italian name for Demeter. And Pluto is Hades. But there's also Cerberus and all these other gods and goddesses. There's Poseidon and Ares and just all sorts of like statues in this garden. And I thought, that's it. I'm going to retell this story. But then the kicker is that Salvador Dali was one of those artists that went there, and he went there in 1948. And I thought, okay, this is how I'm going to do this book. So it's told from the point of view of a model that Salvador Dali brings to this garden of monsters in 1948 Italy.
It's so unique. Yeah, the whole premise, and I love, of course, I love historical fiction, but this is, an aspect of history. Salvador Dali, and that whole area, that this Garden of Monsters, I'd never heard about at all. And I encourage everyone to go to Crystal's website because your research was extensive. I want to back up and say that so this you decided to do a twist on the love story between Hades and Persephone. We were just talking about this. So tell everyone what their story was in a nutshell, if you can, and then and how you kind of made a modern day retelling of it in
Okay.
this Gothic novel.
So the myth of Hades and Persephone, it's not actually a Greek myth, it's a Sicilian myth. Hades lived in Mount Etna, and Persephone was Demeter's daughter. And you have to also remember all these Greek gods were brothers and sisters. And so Demeter is Hades' sister. But Hades sees Persephone gathering flowers at the base of Mount Etna, and he decides that he wants to marry her. So he asks Zeus, "Can I have this girl?" And Zeus says, "Sure, go for it." And so he takes her, and in most of the myths, it's a forceful thing. And certainly, of course, all the Renaissance paintings. There's a sculpture by Bernini in the Villa Borghese in Rome. That's the Rape of Proserpina, where Hades is forcefully taking her down into the underworld. And it's called the Rape of Proserpina. And then there's a lot of stories about her being forcefully taken. There are some myths, however, even back that far in ancient times, that she comes to love him or decides to stay with him. But what happened is that Demeter was so bereft. She was absolutely just lost that her daughter had been stolen from her. And so she wandered the world looking for her, but then she decides she can't find him, or she understands that she's been taken into the underworld. So what she does is she blankets the earth with snow and kills basically all the crops. The animals start dying, the people start dying because they're starving. And Zeus says, "This cannot work. And so you need to figure this out. You can't, Hades, you've got to let her come home." So he had, so Hades was like, I can't let her go entirely because she's eaten from the underworld. And in some of the myths, it's three pomegranate seeds, but in most of them, it's six. And in my story, it's six pomegranate seeds. And so um, the compromise is that Hades gets to spend time with Proserpina or Persephone in the winter time. And so when that is happening, Demeter has blanketed the earth with snow. In the spring, Demeter is getting excited that her daughter is coming home. Summer is when she's able to come back into the overworld. And then fall, there she's becoming sad that she's going to go back down into the underworld. And so that's the story of the seasons. Um, and so it's always been a mother-daughter story, a very traditional mother-daughter story. But then over time, and particularly in current times, it's become this incredible love story. And a lot of the retellings you see now tend to be romance stories or love stories between them. And I went that route. There is a very strong love story here, but there's more than just one love story going on. And I can't really tell you how I subvert the myth, but it's not the myth you just heard. It's similar, but really different. And it's also set in 1948. So, and Salvador Dali. So it's weird. There's some weirdness and ghostiness and strangeness. And yeah.
Right. We don't want to give away any spoilers, but yeah, it's really interesting. I was thinking when I was reading it about the musical Hades Town.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, it's so good. And yeah, that I was like, oh, it's, Hades is having a moment. So
He is.
um like I said, your research for the story was extensive, and you have an amazing website. Clearly, you have a marketing background too. Um, Talk about your research and your deep dive into all of this history, and what your process was, and did you come across any surprises that changed the narrative?
Yeah, so this one was interesting because I'd been to the garden once, and then when I was writing the book, the pandemic, I had just started writing it right after the pandemic. It was the first thing I did when I emerged from it with a vaccine in my arm. And I went on a writing retreat with a few other authors and started this book. But a lot of the research that I was doing before I got to that moment was during COVID. And so and one of the things that was hard was that I couldn't go into the palazzo until after the book was already written and in editing. The first time I was in the palazzo was this last January.
Oh,
And I only got to see a small part of it because only a little bit of it was open. So I had to rely on a lot of photos and video of the palazzo itself. But fortunately, I had been to the garden once. I was able to go again. Actually, I did go while the book was still in the working phase, the editing phase. So I was there in 2022, and I was there again in 2023. And fortunately, my editor, right after she acquired the book, like the week after, she went to the garden. She was going to Italy and she made a detour to go there. So that was really nice. So she understood the story and could work with me on like formulating my vision because she had seen it. She understood it. And what was interesting about it is that on the cover, you can see that the eyes have these like, it's very like stylized, and in the garden itself, like these eyes don't have anything in it. They're holes, except for the 500th anniversary of the creation of the garden by Vicino Orsini. They put glass eyes with these like those same, it's the same thing. So she took a photo, and that's what we took for the cover. So that was kind of cool. But I read tons of books, so many books. I talked with some historians about the garden itself and what the statues all mean and what they, the structure of the garden and that kind of thing. And I read so many books about Salvador Dali and watched a million videos about him to really get a sense of who he was. I read his autobiographies, which are weird, and he would have been canceled so fast. And so how did I and that was like also a challenge. How do I portray this very problematic individual who was also very charismatic and was a genius? He was one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. I mean, of the literal probably the last couple hundred years in some ways. And so how could I portray him in the right way? So there was a ton of research in that regard.
that's so funny. That was actually my next question, because and I use the word, I'm like, Salvador Dali was kind of problematic as a person, like not a great guy, kind of a narcissist,
Well, a
more than
lot of a
kind of.
narcissist.
Yeah, and his wife was kind of a piece of work as well. Gala. Is it Gala? Pronounced Gala? Is
Well,
that
he called her Gala. So
Gala? Okay,
but
okay.
it's said like gala is like how
Yeah.
it's written. She's Russian. So he was definitely a narcissist. He was in for shock and awe. That was his whole modus operandi. Everything he did revolved around getting attention, and that was from very early on. He was also somebody who was a racist. He was kicked out of the Surrealists because he had written a letter to Paul Eulard that described a religion that excluded Black people. He also was an admirer of Franco and of Hitler. He later in life, I think in the 60s or 70s, maybe, he did a painting of Hitler masturbating. You don't actually see it, but it's clear what's happening in the painting.
Hmm.
And in a lot of my research, one of the things that, struggled with is like, how do I talk about this person? He's somebody that I don't think he wasn't somebody who was interested in Nazism, or he wasn't interested in what Franco's policies were or anything like that. What he was interested in was the idea of how much power they wielded. That's what he was interested in. He was a narcissist beyond absolutely everything else, and that's what fueled everything he did. And the kind of people that he admired as well. He also admired Freud and Picasso, and he created this. If you look up the Google painting of his picture of Picasso, it's a weird painting, and like it's like partially of a woman, and if I'm remembering correctly, the Picasso's chin, it doesn't look like Picasso at all, by the way, but the Picasso's chin is like these flattened pancake breasts of some woman. It's like just bizarre, and Picasso hated it and never talked to him afterwards. So, like, he was just into shock. Absolutely. If he could shock you, he would. I wonder what he thought of Madonna, because he was still alive when she took the to the stage, right? But yeah, he was wild. But to talk about Galah briefly
Yeah.
too. So history has a real sense of like, how do we look back at history and the women that have been maligned by history? How do we make them into, well, how do we tell their true stories? Galah's story is kind of, she was mean, she was nasty, and there's stories of her hitting people at parties. She was ruthless about how Dali would make money. She was not faithful to him, and he knew this. He sanctioned this. He was a voyeur, and that worked out really well because he didn't really want to touch people, but he liked to watch. And so Galah had all of these lovers, and he would watch. So just, and in fact, so much so that he bought her a castle when she was like in her 70s or 80s, so that she could entertain one of her paramours, who was the young actor that was in Jesus Christ Superstar in the 70s. And he could only visit the castle if he had a written invitation from her.
Dolly could only visit if he
Yeah.
had a written invitation.
Yes, correct.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wild. Just so weird couple.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That
I got to play
definitely,
with
I
that.
feel like you captured them well. They were a little, they were more than a little odd. Yeah. Um, so food is an important aspect to the story, as it has been your other novels. And I want to, and I was just, we were just talking before this started. If you go to Crystal's website and you sign up for a newsletter, you'll have access to the 3 cookbooks that accompany each of her novels, which I thought was super cool. I love to cook. I love food. Um, Talk about how you talk about these amazing dinners and how you incorporated food into this particular story.
Yeah, so my first novel is about an ancient Roman gourmand who was really real. His name was Apicius, and he died in a messed up way. So I tell the story of how he got there. And my second novel is about a Renaissance chef who was a celebrity chef in his time, and he wrote a cookbook that was a best-selling cookbook that published in 1570. But it was best-selling for almost 200 years after he died. And he was chef to several popes and cardinals. And so during my research of those 2 books, I learned so much about food history in Italy in general, just tons of things. Mostly because in those eras, particularly in ancient Rome, what we know are snippets of things, and so it tends to be those eras tend to be mentioned in compendiums of Italian food history. So I learned a lot about food across the eras, and so that served me well when I got to this book. And so this particular book is not about a culinary figure, but there's food involved because she has to eat 6 pomegranate seeds. And in my story, she needs to eat them. And or at least my characters believe that she needs to eat them. And so I have to have some feasts that some pomegranate seeds show up in. And so I got to play upon the food history and that I had researched and learned over the years. So there's, for example, there's a feast, a medieval comes from the medieval novel called the Hypnerotomachia Pamphili, which is a story of this man named Polifilio, and he has this wild dream of him trying to get back his lover who has left him. And so in this book, there's this feast of like many courses, and every course the food is a different color, and the servers change colors of the tablecloths and their clothing, and like it's a big like visual spectacle. So I have lots of that kind of thing. So it's fun and super cool to go that route. And then because I want to find out what those foods taste like, I try a lot of recreating of those. My husband is where he loves to cook, so and I love to bake, so that works out really well. And then for the cookbooks, I worked with these I worked with food historians, food book bloggers, and some chefs to recreate these recipes. And if so, it's great. Like if you have a book club and you want to read the book, you can also cook all of the food,
So great.
which is super fun.
Do you have a favorite recipe from this novel?
I do. It's the recipe that shows up on it's like the second sentence of the first part of the book. Like, here, I'll read it to you because
Oh
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
it took me years to find Julia Farnese, but no time at all to win her confidence. I did so with an unassuming cherry rose tart. And I had to figure out how to make a cherry rose tart. And so I did, and it's so good. It's like
Oh,
I could eat
nice.
it every day for the rest of my life and be happy. So, yeah. And that recipe is actually in the back of the book when you buy it.
Oh, okay. I missed that somehow. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
this
it's probably not in the one you have because you have an
this is
arc.
the arc. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So how was it? This is your first two novels were really food centric. They, and centered around a person who is involved in the food world, even though it's historical fiction. Um, but this one is, this gothic reimagining of Hades and Persephone. How was that for you? Like to do something really different than the first two novels?
It's so historical fiction, and you know this because you write historical fiction. You're connecting the dots between what you know, and what you don't know. So, like, you get to fill in gaps. You're just filling in gaps in a timeline for the most part and putting some emotion behind the things that occurred and giving color to factual events. In this book, there's only a few factual events that really the factual thing is the garden exists, and I try to stay true to the layout of the garden and the why the garden was created. I take some liberties with Giulia Farnese, who's the wife of Icino Orsini, who created the garden. But I don't have, and I have to get some things right about Salvador Dali and his character and his history. And I do make some nods toward the future. So, for example, I talk about one of the meals in the book is from his 1973 cookbook, which of course has not been created in 1948, but he's talking about the vision of a cookbook. And so some of the recipes are his vision in this book. And so that was hard because I had to make it all up in a way that I'm just not used to doing for novels. And it was both freeing and terrifying at the same time,
Yeah.
I think. But it was good because it meant that I had a lot of freedom to explore the characters and the situations and to do things that I can't do in historical fiction. Because I believe in historical fiction, I should stay as true to the facts as I can. But this, I didn't have to really do that.
Yeah, yeah. Like you said, that the Salvador Dali and his wife obviously were real people in history, but then you had a lot of leeway with the other,
Yeah.
when you're dealing with mythology. So yeah, so interesting. Another question I have, the next few questions are writing questions, like I always ask, and then we'll take some questions if you want to put them in the chat or in the Q&A for Crystal. I will field questions from the audience. You've also written poetry, which, like I said, so impressive at a high level. So, do you have a preference between poetry and long form fiction?
So it's funny. I wrote mostly poetry for the first, like, I don't know, it's 10, 20 years maybe after I got out of school.
Oh, wow.
Mostly because I felt like I could finish it. A novel seemed big. It seemed like when would I have enough time to sit my butt in a chair for that long? Like it just seemed like an insurmountable amount of time that I would have to spend on that. But poetry was compact. I could complete it. But what happened is when I started, I went and got my MFA in critical and creative thinking. And my thesis was on creative writing exercises for authors in the middle of their stories. And I wanted to shop around a creative writing book. And so when I started doing that, agents told me, no one knows who you are, so you need to either teach these exercises, or you need to write a book with these exercises, or someone else needs to write a book with these exercises. And so I thought, okay, I'll start teaching. So I started teaching. And then at some point I thought I should really write the book because I want to sell this other thing. But once I did that, I and my all my energy went into that. I haven't really written much poetry at all in the last probably 15 years. But I love reading it. I really
Yeah.
do appreciate it on a level. But it is something I know that I will go back to at some point.
Yeah, I'm sure. Because sounds like it was your first love, your first foray into creative
Yeah.
writing. Yeah. I'm always impressed with poets. I don't know how you do it. In terms of long form fiction novels, this is a question I always ask. What's your process? Are you a plotter? Do you plot, or do you write by the seat of your pants? Or are you a pantser?
So, so for those of you watching, I attended an event this weekend in which Jane was moderating for Greer McAllister. And Greer was saying how she plots it and then abandons it. So the whole time I'm in the audience, I'm just shaking my head. I'm like, that's exactly what I do. Because I will plot it all out. I have a spreadsheet that with historical fiction, it's a little bit different because you're working with timelines, and sometimes you have to figure out, what do I need to get in the timeline in these chapters? But I started that same process here, and I abandoned it halfway through. But when I start to run into big problems like that I just can't solve, I will go back and try to, at least if I don't plot it, what I'll do is I will handwrite, just like free write summaries of the chapter, and just like get it all out. And what do I want to have happen? Not necessarily the story itself, but just like, summarizing the plot points of it. And sometimes that helps. So I'm a bit of a pantser plotter hybrid.
Hybrid planter.
Yeah.
Got it. Um, what is some of this is your third novel. You've also written poetry. You've taught writing. What is the best advice you can give about writing and about getting published? I know we have a lot of aspiring authors in the audience, so
So I wrote my first novel on weekends. It took me 4 or 5 years basically, but I did it on weekends here and there. I was not consistent at all. But one of the things that happened is I fell in love with writing books, and especially with my second novel. And I thought, this is really what I want to do with my life. Someday I have a day job, because it makes me more money than I can make as an author at this point in my career. But one of the things I figured, if I want to be a career author, either two things have to happen. Either I have to be lucky or I have to be prolific. And I don't have control over lucky, but I have control over prolific. And I believe enough in my talents that I don't have to worry about that as much. I think I can write solidly. So prolific is what I focused on. And the only way you can be prolific is to sit your butt in the chair every day. And so, I have made a pact with myself to try to write at least 400 words a day or edit for an hour a day. So I spend every morning for an hour before I do anything else really. I get my coffee and then I start writing. And then that if I can do that consistently, I can write a book a year. And what the reason why I bring this up, because not everybody thinks like they can do this every day. But the reason I think consistency matters is because the book lives in your head, and your characters start to breathe when you're sleeping and when you are doing random things. You can think about your book and have conversations with those characters in your head in a way that you just can't when you're not consistent. So this is why you keep hearing the advice from a lot of very famous authors. Stephen King is a big proponent of every day you need to sit your butt in the chair and you need to write. But that's why. It's because the way that your characters talk to you is just completely different if you can do that. And 400 words is like 2 pages. So,
that's
it's
true.
really not a lot.
It's good advice, and I think too, like when I'm working consistently on the project, that's when your subconscious kicks in. So like I'll be driving in a car or taking a shower, and I'm like, oh, that's how I fix that, or that's what
Yep.
happens next here. And I think that's really true. If you're only like dabbling here and there, you don't kind of get that momentum. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally agree.
I talk to
You said,
myself a lot in the car, actually.
yeah, yeah. I'll dictate
Too.
into my phone,
Yeah.
You said you could talk a little bit about what you're working on now.
So I have a book that's coming out right now. I think the date is like December next year. And we're working on the title. So I can't talk about that because I'm not 500% sure on the title yet. But it's a story about nefarious gods stealing happiness from the world. And they're Greek gods, but they're really obscure. Like you might not have ever heard of them. And it's contemporary. It's set in 2019, right before the pandemic. And it's a total swerve. It's not historical fiction. It's
Oh,
no,
wow.
there's no food in it. It's a very different story than what I was doing previously. But there is some history in it because my character is a historian, and the thing, one part of her job is to go to different historical places in Italy and record them as a historian. So there's lots of Italy in the book and there's a lot of London in the book. And there's a lot of history, but in real small bits and pieces. Not it's I wouldn't call it historical fiction, but I can't let the history totally slide.
And that's already written. You're done with that.
Yeah, we're in edits right now. I'm in edits, I should say.
Amazing. Good for the congratulations. That's a lot of work between this and this one coming out
Yeah,
next week.
my editor was like, "Can I have edits by October 1st?" I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
we negotiated to October 15th. I think I'm
Oh,
good. I
that's
can do
good.
that.
That's good. I should mention this comes out September 24th. Talk about this very cool, unique cover because I see covers all the time. And this one I was like, oh, that's really different. I love this. Did you have a
I
say in the design or?
I did.
Oh,
I
nice.
But the good thing was is when they brought me back the idea of the design, like they brought me back the first parts, like the first ideas. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is exactly how I pictured it."
Awesome.
What we did is we talked about like comp covers, what books in this genre do I like? What kinds of like styles do I like? What are my colors that I like? Originally, this cover was red because I like clearly like a lot of red.
Yeah.
Um, and it was super cool. But then when the sales team saw it, they looked at it and they said, "This looks like a Chinese dragon, and it might not send the right idea of what the story
Um,
is about." And I looked at it like a Chinese like food, joint kind of thing. And I looked at it, I was like, "Yeah, that's totally what it looks like." So we shifted to the blue, and it worked out really well. And especially because you still have the pomegranates. If you notice, there's 6 seeds in all of the pomegranates too.
oh, so clever.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then of
And
course,
I was saying I didn't even see the monster face until like the other day. I was like, oh, that's what that is.
yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
originally she had a 1940s dress on, but it made her look too much like a little kid in the doorway. So we went with the Greek chiton instead, just because it just made more sense for understanding what the story was with that by just looking at the cover. So
Awesome. Yeah. And if anyone has questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A for Crystal. Um, I'm really into movies. I want to ask, is there any movie interest and who would play um Dali and who would play the main character Julia, his muse in this?
So, gosh, what's her name? So my husband and I've been talking about this because I've been getting this question. He thinks Jake Gyllenhaal would be a great Dali. And
Oh,
I at first wasn't entirely sure, but then he started showing me pictures of him like next to Dali, and I was like, okay, I could see this transformation. Whether or not he could pull off the accent and stuff like that, I don't know, but he would be interesting. And then Emma Stone, no, Elle Fanning. I
oh
think
yes.
Emma. Wait, the Fannings I get confused. Which is
Oh,
the
Elle
youngest
is the
one?
younger one.
Elle is the youngest one.
Yeah, and
If
Dakota's the older one.
I
Yeah.
think Elle would be a great Julia. Like that is the kind of like because she's a blonde model, she's
The
young,
look.
she's like that to me, like she could be like a really great Julia. I don't know who would play Gala or the other characters. I haven't really thought too much. Oh, he did have an idea of Jack. Who did he have for Jack? it was somebody that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but at first I was like, I don't know about that. That's not who I have in for Jack. So it's kind of funny. It's like when you first hear the audiobook for the first time, the audiobook is so weird to listen to because it's like somebody else wrote this story and not you. And
Hmm.
it's the same kind of thing, like how I imagine it's the same because what other people's ideas of it are never going to be exactly the same as what I had. And I remember when I first heard the audiobook for Feast of Sorrow, one of my characters is a big, beefy Egyptian bodyguard and like huge guy. And he did the voice for him. And I just started laughing. I'm in the car by myself listening to it, laughing hysterically because it just wasn't what I didn't have an idea in my head what he sounded like, but that I just wasn't it. It turned out I fell in love with the story and he did an incredible job on that audiobook. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing. I can't I'm not sure who else should be.
Right, because they're in your head as who they
Yeah.
are, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hard to know. It says there's a question here from Graziella Machetta.
Oh, Graziella is un buon amica.
Oh,
So she is one of my Italian tutor and
oh,
a
so
dear
lovely.
friend.
So she says, "Hi, my brilliant friend. Can you tell us anything about the etymology of the name Bomarzo?"
Oh, I don't actually know that. Now I'm gonna have to look that up because
Oh,
I actually don't know the
oh,
etymology for that. It's in the Tuscia region, which is, like I said, an hour north of Rome. It's near Viterbo. And Caparola. Caparola is a city that where Cardinal Farnese had his palazzo, and that's originally where I went. And the driver said, "Oh, there's this crazy garden. You want to go check it out?" And we're like, "Okay." But the Caparola has a pentagonal palazzo in it that is the design. It's the inspiration for our Pentagon. Um,
okay.
so
I was thinking, like, what's the closest place to the garden? Like, where would you stay if you were to see this garden? Like, what's
well,
the
you can stay
closest
in
town?
Bomarzo.
Oh, you can.
Yeah, you can actually stay in the palazzo. There's
Oh,
a couple B&Bs in the palazzo, which I have not done, but um,
nice.
I don't think it's as ghosty as my story is. I don't know, but
And
it's old. It's from the 1500s. So,
so,
and Bomarzo is a cute little village. It's very medieval. It's just a sleepy town, not much going on. And yeah, it's very old. Like it's like I would say most of the buildings are between 1100 and 1500s when they were built. So
how often do you get back to Italy? I know you're a huge,
once
uh,
a year if I can. Yeah.
nice, nice. Good
So
for you. That's amazing. Um,
yeah.
well, this was delightful. Thank you so much for coming on, Crystal. And I wish you so much success with the launch next week in the
Thank
Garden
you.
of Monsters. Tell people how they can keep in touch with you and what and how, as particularly if they want you to Zoom with their book club too. What's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, so you can find me at crystalking.com, and that's you can sign up for my blog there, my Substack. I also have, which is free by the way. A lot of Substacks want you to pay, and I don't ask for that. If you wanted to be a patron, I would not complain. But and then I'm also on Threads, and you can find that link on my site as well, and on Facebook and on Instagram. And then you can also download my cookbooks. The other thing that you can also do on my site is I have 2 pages um, dedicated specifically to places in my garden and the people. So there's a page just on the Sacro Bosco garden, which means sacred wood. And then there's also you can see all the pictures of all the statues and everything, which is wild. It's so cool. Even
So
you just
cool.
go check that out. And then there's a whole page on Dali and all of the weirdness that was Dali and Gala, and so you can check that out as well.
Yes, such a cool website filled with like I said, you can tell you're in marketing because the website's excellent, and I everyone should go check it out.
And you can
Um,
also sign get there's a page for book clubs there as well, so I'm
oh,
happy to
perfect,
check that.
excellent. Well, thank you again. This was delightful. And this will be recorded. I will send you the link so everyone can watch it. Everyone who missed it tonight. Next month for Historical Happy Hour, I have a huge busy October with Linda Leugman, Joy Jordan Lake, Emily Bleeker, Samantha Woodruff, and Tosca Lee. And you'll get invites via MailChimp if you signed up for my mailing list, or you can go to janehealy.com to register. Again, best of luck. So lovely to talk to you, Crystal. I
You
wish you
too.
know, I hope the book soars.
Me
Congratulations.
too.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.
And thanks
Have a good night,
everybody for
everyone.
coming.
Thank